Mesopotamia is often remembered as one of the first great centers of human civilization, but the name itself is more descriptive than ancient. It means the land between the rivers, referring to the broad region lying between the Tigris and Euphrates. For thousands of years, these rivers shaped every part of life there. They carried water through dry country, deposited rich silt after floods, and created a landscape that could be unexpectedly fertile in one season and demanding in the next. People did not simply live beside these rivers. They organized their farming, their settlements, and even their religious ideas around them. In a place where rain could be uncertain, the steady presence of river water made possible fields of barley, groves of date palms, and thick layers of mud brick cities slowly rising from the flat horizon. When we picture Mesopotamia, it helps to imagine not just famous ruins and old tablets, but the quiet rhythm of irrigation channels, shallow canals, and workers moving through warm earth under a wide sky. Long before written history, communities were already settling in Mesopotamia and experimenting with agriculture, animal herding, and village life. Archaeologists have found traces of small farming settlements that gradually became more complex over time, especially in the southern part of the region. These early people did not suddenly invent civilization in a single moment. Instead, over many generations, they learned how to gather wild grains, domesticate sheep and goats, and manage water more carefully. The transition from village to city was slow and uneven, and in some areas it likely happened in stages that are still debated by scholars. Even so, by the 4th millennium BCE, large settlements such as Uruk were beginning to show features that feel unmistakably urban: dense neighborhoods, administrative buildings, specialized labor, and long-distance trade. In the quiet language of archaeology, this is the story of gradual human cooperation, where small decisions about planting and storage eventually made possible something much larger than any one household. One of the most remarkable achievements associated with Mesopotamia was the development of cuneiform writing. At first, writing was not poetry or storytelling, but administration. People needed a reliable way to record goods, labor, taxes, and deliveries. So they began pressing signs into soft clay using a reed stylus, creating wedge-shaped marks that later gave cuneiform its name. The earliest tablets are often brief and practical, almost like memory aids for temple officials or merchants. Yet from such humble beginnings came a system that lasted for more than 3,000 years and adapted to many different languages. Scholars still study the smallest variations in these signs, because they reveal how scribes were trained and how writing evolved. When a clay tablet dried in the sun or was accidentally baked in a fire, it could survive for millennia. That is why the modern world can still read messages from a landscape so old, messages left by people who likely never imagined they would outlast their own cities. In many Mesopotamian cities, the temple was not only a religious center, but also an economic and administrative one. Temples owned land, managed herds, stored grain, and employed workers. They were often among the largest and most organized institutions in a city. People brought offerings to the gods, but they also looked to temple institutions for stability, food distribution, and ritual order. This blending of sacred and practical life can feel unfamiliar at first, yet it made sense in a world where divine favor and material survival were closely linked. A temple courtyard might smell of incense, grain dust, and damp clay, while scribes inside carefully counted cattle or barley rations. Priests, workers, and artisans all played roles in maintaining the system. Over time, some rulers grew powerful enough to challenge or cooperate with these temple centers, but throughout much of Mesopotamian history, religion and administration remained deeply intertwined, almost like two sides of the same structure. Among the most famous Mesopotamian cities was Ur, located near the southern marshes and the lower Euphrates. Ur became especially prominent in the 3rd millennium BCE, and is often remembered for its monumental architecture, including the great ziggurat dedicated to the moon god Nana. A ziggurat was a step temple platform built from mud brick and stone facings where available, rising above the flat plain like a man-made hill. To ancient eyes, such structures may have symbolized a link between earth and sky, human effort and divine presence. The city itself was connected to trade routes reaching far beyond Mesopotamia, with goods moving in from the Gulf, Iran, Anatolia, and the Indus region. Excavations at Ur have revealed wealth, craftsmanship, and burial practices that suggest a highly organized and stratified society. And yet, even at its height, Ur was built of fragile materials. Mud brick walls required constant repair, and canals needed continual maintenance. The grandeur of the city was always balanced by the quiet labor required to keep it standing. Mesopotamian society depended heavily on writing, but it also depended on a broad class of specialists who could read, copy, calculate, and interpret. Scribes were among the most respected educated professionals in the region. Training for this role was demanding and lengthy, involving memorization of sign lists, mathematical exercises, and copying literary and legal texts. Some tablets found in schools show repeated lines written again and again, as students practiced the shape and order of signs. This training created a shared intellectual culture across cities and kingdoms, because scribes carried knowledge from one generation to the next. They wrote contracts, royal inscriptions, myths, hymns, and letters. In doing so, they preserved not only official records, but also the everyday texture of life. We learn from their tablets about property disputes, harvests, travel, family relationships, and even jokes or complaints. The scribal classroom, with its clay, reeds, and careful corrections, was one of the quiet engines of Mesopotamian civilization. The law codes associated with Mesopotamia are among the best-known ancient texts, and the Code of Hammurabi is especially famous. Hammurabi ruled Babylon in the 18th century BCE, and his law collection was carved onto a stone stele, accompanied by a relief image showing the king receiving authority from a god. The code is not a modern legal system in the contemporary sense, and scholars debate how literally it was applied. Still, it reveals much about values, social hierarchies, and ideas of justice. The laws address property, trade, injury, marriage, slavery, and labor, often distinguishing between social classes in ways that feel stark to modern readers. Some punishments were severe, while other rules seem surprisingly detailed and practical. The stele itself was meant to be seen, perhaps standing in a public place where it could announce royal order. Whether every law was enforced exactly, as written, remains uncertain, but the text endures as a carefully crafted statement that a ruler wanted to present himself as a keeper of balance in a complicated world. Babylon eventually became one of the most celebrated names in the ancient Near East, and much of its fame comes from the way later cultures remembered it as a place of wealth, learning, and imperial power. The city rose to prominence under different dynasties, but it is especially associated with Hammurabi and later with the Neo-Babylonian kings. Babylon had temples, palaces, processional streets, and monumental gates decorated with brilliant glazed bricks. The most famous of these, the Ishtar Gate, was covered in blue glaze and relief images of bulls and dragons, creating a visual effect that must have been striking in the sunlight. Ancient visitors would have encountered not just architecture, but sound and movement. Priests, guards, merchants, pilgrims, and animals all moving through the city's avenues. Babylon's reputation grew even in antiquity, becoming a symbol of imperial ambition and cultural grandeur. At the same time, it was a working city, dependent on agriculture, bureaucracy, and the persistent maintenance that every Mesopotamian center required. Mesopotamian religion was highly varied, but it often reflected a deep awareness of the city as a place under divine guardianship. Different cities honored different patron gods and goddesses, and people saw the divine world as active in everyday life. The gods were powerful, but they were not distant abstractions. They were thought to care about offerings, rituals, dreams, omens, and the moral or ceremonial order of the world. Myths surviving on tablets show gods creating, arguing, traveling, and making decisions that affect human destiny. One of the best-known stories, the Epic of Gilgamesh, explores mortality, friendship, kingship, and the limits of human power. It also contains a flood narrative that has invited comparison with other ancient traditions, though its exact relationship to them is still studied carefully. Mesopotamian myths were not merely entertainment. They helped people think about suffering, authority, the passing of time, and the fragile line between the human and the divine. Even now, their imagery carries a quiet emotional weight, as if preserved in the cooled surface of the tablets themselves. Because Mesopotamia was mostly a land of plains, irrigation was essential, but irrigation also required maintenance, coordination, and political power. Canals had to be dug, cleaned, and monitored so water could be directed to fields at the right time. This made agriculture both productive and vulnerable. If canals silted up or if water was mismanaged, yields could fall. If too much water entered the soil, salinization could damage crops over time. Scholars have long examined how environmental pressures shaped Mesopotamian history, though exact causal stories are often more complex than simple collapse narratives suggest. In some areas, farmers shifted from wheat to more salt-tolerant barley. In others, political change, warfare, and migration interacted with ecological stress in ways that are still being pieced together. What stands out is the degree to which the land itself was not passive. It influenced settlement patterns, city growth, and state power. Life in Mesopotamia was a constant negotiation with water, mud, heat, and time, a daily effort to keep order in a landscape that never stayed still for long. Trade connected Mesopotamia to places far beyond its river valleys, and this exchange brought both goods and ideas. Mesopotamians imported timber, stone, metals, shells, lapis lazuli, and other materials that were scarce. One of the most remarkable things about Mesopotamia is that it was not a single simple kingdom, but a long, shifting world of cities, canals, fields, and rival powers that rose and fell over thousands of years. Even the name itself comes from Greek and means the land between rivers, a quiet description of a place shaped by the Tigris and Euphrates. In the broad sweep of history, this region stretched across much of modern Iraq, parts of Syria and Turkey, and nearby lands, though its boundaries were never fixed in the way modern borders are. People living there would not have thought of themselves as Mesopotamians in the modern sense. They were Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and many others, each with local customs and city loyalties. Yet from a distance, their civilizations formed one long conversation across time, carried through clay tablets, irrigation channels, temple traditions, and the patient labor of farmers and scribes. It is one reason Mesopotamia feels so layered to historians. Every generation built upon earlier ones, sometimes quite literally, with newer cities rising atop older ruins in the soft earth. Long before stone temples or grand palaces, the first settlements in southern Mesopotamia were shaped by the delicate balance between river flooding and dry heat. The land was fertile but not gentle. Rain was unreliable, and the summer sun could be intense, so communities depended on carefully managed water from canals and ditches. This gave Mesopotamian life a special rhythm. The rivers did not simply nourish the fields, they demanded planning, cooperation, and constant repair. Farmers had to clear silt, maintain embankments, and guide water where it was needed at the right time. In a way, the entire civilization grew from this practical knowledge of water. Some historians believe that the pressure to organize labor for irrigation helped encourage the earliest forms of administration and social hierarchy. A canal was not just a channel of water. It was also a line of authority, a record of who worked, who owned, and who controlled the harvest. In that sense, the landscape itself helped shape the state. As towns became cities, temples came to occupy a central place in public life. In Mesopotamia, religious buildings were not hidden away from society. They stood at the heart of the city, often on raised terraces or platforms, visible from a distance across the flat plain. The ziggurat, with its stepped profile, became one of the most iconic forms of ancient architecture in the region. These structures were not pyramids in the Egyptian sense, and they were not intended as tombs. They were elevated sanctuaries, likely meant to bring worship closer to the gods, and perhaps to mark a sacred mountain in a land that had few natural heights. The brick surfaces would have been coated, repaired, and renewed over time, giving them a living quality. In the early morning light, a ziggurat may have seemed to float above the city, its summit catching the first pale warmth while shadows gathered below. Though only ruins remain today, it is still possible to imagine the solemn soundscape around such a place. Footsteps on packed earth, offerings carried in woven baskets, low prayers spoken in the shade. The cities themselves were surprisingly varied. Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, Babylon, Nineveh, and Ashur each had their own identities, rulers, patron gods, and local histories. Some flourished as trade centers, others as religious capitals, and others as military strongholds. At their height, these cities could be dense and complex, crowded with workshops, grain stores, administrative offices, and family homes built from mud brick. Streets were narrow and often irregular, shaped by long use rather than by a strict grid. Roofs were flat, useful for drying grain, sleeping on warm nights, or catching evening breezes. Within the urban fabric, life moved in layers: scribes recording transactions, artisans shaping metal or pottery, merchants negotiating prices, and children carrying water from wells or canals. Archaeologists sometimes uncover whole neighborhoods where the arrangement of rooms suggests daily routines rather than royal grandeur, reminding us that the ancient city was not only a stage for kings. It was also a place of ordinary meals, worn thresholds, and the repeated small gestures of domestic life. Mesopotamian writing emerged from this administrative world, and its earliest purpose was practical rather than literary. Clay tokens, then clay tablets, were used to track goods, labor, and ownership. Over time, these markings developed into cuneiform, a wedge-shaped script pressed into soft clay with a reed stylus. The earliest forms of writing may have looked almost like accounting shorthand, a way to manage the complicated flow of barley, livestock, oil, and textiles through temples and palaces. Yet writing gradually expanded far beyond record-keeping. It became a means for poetry, law, hymns, omens, letters, and scholarly commentary. One of the most important consequences of this invention is that Mesopotamia left behind an enormous archive of voices, though they are filtered through official and elite contexts. Thousands of tablets survive, some fragmentary, some complete, many covered in lists, contracts, and calculations. To modern eyes, they can seem dry, but together they reveal a civilization deeply invested in memory, precision, and the power of recorded knowledge. A tablet was small, portable, and vulnerable, yet once fired or dried, it could preserve a thought for millennia. Among the best-known achievements of Mesopotamian scholarship is its mathematics. The people of this region used a sexagesimal, or base 60 system, which may seem unusual today, yet it was remarkably flexible. It helped them work with fractions, measurements, and astronomical cycles. The echoes of that system remain in our modern division of the hour into 60 minutes, and the circle into 360 degrees. Mesopotamian scribes produced mathematical tables, multiplication lists, and practical problem texts that show impressive sophistication. They calculated areas, volumes, and interest on loans. Some tablets appear to present abstract problems that may have been used for training or advanced study. Their approach was not symbolic in the modern algebraic style, but it was careful and inventive. You can picture a scribe in a quiet room, stylus in hand, making repeated impressions in damp clay, pausing to smooth a line and begin again. There is something soothing in that methodical work, a reminder that large civilizations often depend on small, repeated acts of mental discipline. Astronomy and astrology also flourished in Mesopotamia, where the night sky was closely observed over many generations. With their long, clear evenings and open horizons, observers could track the movements of stars, planets, the moon, and eclipses with unusual continuity. Mesopotamian scholars recorded celestial phenomena on tablets, noting patterns and attempting to interpret them as messages from the gods or signs about earthly events. Their records were not simply mystical guesses, though. They were grounded in observation. Over time, this accumulation of data allowed for increasingly accurate predictions of lunar and planetary cycles. Some of the oldest systematic astronomical traditions in the world emerged here, yet the boundary between science and divination was not the same as it is today. A lunar eclipse might be both a measurable event and a matter of deep political concern. Kings consulted specialists who read the heavens as a way to prepare for danger or to seek reassurance. On a still night beneath a field of stars, the sky itself may have felt like a written text waiting to be interpreted. Law was another area in which Mesopotamian society left a lasting imprint. The famous legal traditions associated with rulers like Hammurabi were not the only laws in the region, but they are among the most widely known because of the surviving inscriptions. These legal texts were often framed as royal declarations of justice, meant to establish order in a world of disputes over property, marriage, injury, debt, and labor. The laws reflect a society that was highly structured and deeply unequal, with different consequences depending on status. Still, they also reveal an attempt to formalize expectations and make social obligations visible. A law code was more than a list of punishments. It was also a statement about what kings believed their role should be: to protect the weak, define boundaries, and reduce chaos. Whether the laws were applied exactly as written is still debated by scholars. Some think they served more as an idealized model than a practical courtroom manual. Even so, they remain one of the clearest windows into how Mesopotamians imagined justice, responsibility, and the fragile balance of communal life. Trade tied Mesopotamia to distant places, giving the region access to materials it did not possess naturally in abundance. Southern Mesopotamia lacked substantial timber, stone, and certain metals, so merchants and rulers looked outward. They exchanged grain, textiles, dates, and crafted goods for cedar wood, copper, tin, precious stones, and shell. These exchange networks stretched toward Anatolia, the Levant, the Iranian highlands, the Persian Gulf, and beyond. In some periods, Mesopotamian traders traveled by riverboat or caravan, following routes that connected city to city and culture to culture. This movement of goods also moved ideas, technologies, and styles. Seals, weights, and administrative practices traveled with merchants. Some foreign materials were treasured for their rarity, while others were essential for weapons, tools, and construction. The economy of Mesopotamia was never isolated. It depended on a wider world, and that wider world was touched in return by Mesopotamian influence. A piece of lapis lazuli, deep blue and cool to the touch, may have traveled a vast distance before being set into jewelry or temple ornament, carrying with it the quiet memory of many hands. Mesopotamian religion was equally rich and deeply woven into everyday life. Rather than a single unified system, it consisted of many local cults and mythologies that changed over time. Cities often honored their own patron deities, and people participated in rituals to seek favor, protection, fertility, and order. Gods were imagined as powerful, human-like beings who could be honored with offerings, hymns, processions, and temple service. Myths described creation, divine councils, cosmic conflicts, and the place of humans in the world. Some of the most famous stories, including versions of the flood narrative and the Epic of Gilgamesh, explore mortality, friendship, grief, and the search for meaning. In the broad, sunlit landscapes of Mesopotamia, clay was never just clay. It was the quiet material of civilization itself, gathered from riverbanks, kneaded with water, and shaped into the walls, tablets, figurines, and vessels that filled daily life. Because stone and timber were scarce in much of the region, the people of the Tigris and Euphrates learned to make nearly everything from the earth beneath their feet. Sun-dried bricks, soft at first and then hardened by heat, formed homes and temples alike. Even the most ordinary bowl, pressed quickly by hand, could carry a meal, a ration, or a small offering. Archaeologists often find these humble objects in layers of dust, and they speak softly of a world where practicality and ingenuity were closely linked. Clay also preserved language itself, turning into tablets that have outlasted palaces, and so the material that shaped a roof could also carry a prayer, a contract, or a school exercise across thousands of years. Writing in Mesopotamia began, as far as scholars can tell, not as literature but as administration. The earliest signs seem to have emerged from the needs of counting grain, recording livestock, and managing the movement of goods through temples and storehouses. Over time, simple marks pressed into clay became increasingly stylized, slowly evolving into cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script recognized today. It was a writing system used by many different peoples over many centuries, and its signs could serve for Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and other languages as well. Learning to write was difficult, and scribes trained for years, copying lists of signs, words, and model texts in the dim rooms of scribal schools. There is something intimate in that process, the repetition of the same shapes over and over in damp clay, until the hand and mind moved almost together. What began as an accounting tool became a vehicle for law, myth, diplomacy, poetry, and memory, a development so gradual that it can feel almost like watching thought itself become visible. The rivers of Mesopotamia gave life, but they did not always give it gently. The flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates was less predictable than the seasonal rhythms of the Nile, and that uncertainty shaped how communities lived and organized themselves. Too little water could mean hardship and dry fields, while too much could sweep away crops and damage irrigation channels. So people built canals, dikes, reservoirs, and levees, working constantly to guide water where it was needed. This long effort made Mesopotamian society deeply attentive to administration and collective labor. Water management was not a side task, it was the structure upon which agriculture depended. Fields of barley, the hard-working grain suited to salty soils and dry heat, stretched across the floodplains when conditions were favorable. Dates, flax, onions, and many other crops also supported life in the region. The landscape itself was never still, and Mesopotamian communities lived in a state of careful adjustment, reading the sky, the river, and the soil as if all three were part of the same conversation. Among the most enduring achievements of Mesopotamia were its legal traditions, especially the well-known laws associated with Hammurabi, king of Babylon in the 18th century BCE. His law code, carved into stone, was not the first legal collection in the ancient Near East, but it is one of the best preserved and most famous. The code presents a society concerned with property, family, labor, injury, and responsibility, all arranged in a formal and highly structured manner. It is often remembered for the principle of retribution, sometimes summarized as an eye for an eye, though the reality was more complex than that phrase suggests. Penalties varied according to social status and circumstance, and the code likely served as both practical legal reference and royal statement of justice. Standing before that stone stele, if one could have done so in antiquity, would have meant encountering law as something public, solemn, and nearly architectural. Yet the code itself may not have functioned exactly like a modern legal manual. Rather, it reflected an idealized vision of order, one that revealed how rulers wanted justice to be seen and understood. Religion in Mesopotamia was woven into everyday life so thoroughly that separating the sacred from the practical can be difficult. Cities were often centered on temple complexes, and each major city commonly had a patron deity believed to protect it and define its character. These gods and goddesses were not distant abstractions, but active presences in a world full of meaning, capable of sending favor, warning, blessing, or storm. Temples housed offerings, images, and ritual specialists who maintained daily worship. Food, incense, and carefully prepared materials were brought before divine statues as gifts of sustenance and respect. People prayed for health, fertility, safe travel, and the success of harvests and families. Many rituals aimed to keep the cosmos in balance, since the Mesopotamians often understood order as fragile and in need of constant attention. Their gods could be majestic, but they were also deeply tied to the rhythms of city life, river life, and the ordinary vulnerability of human existence. In this way, religion became not an escape from the world, but a method of living within it. The ziggurat remains one of the most recognizable images of Mesopotamian civilization, though it was not a temple in the modern sense. It was more like a staged, rising platform, built in steps and usually crowned by a sanctuary at the top. Made of mud brick and often faced with baked brick, these structures dominated city skylines, creating a visible link between earth and sky. The best-known examples, such as the ziggurat at Ur, still evoke a sense of awe even in ruin. Scholars continue to discuss the exact ritual functions of these buildings, but they clearly served as focal points for religious and civic identity. Their mass and height suggested permanence in a landscape where daily life could be fragile. Climbing them would have meant leaving the noise of the streets below and ascending toward a quieter, elevated space, where the air might have felt different, and the city spread out beneath like a map of familiar roofs and courtyards. Even in fragmentary form, ziggurats convey a human desire to reach upward in a controlled, deliberate way. Mesopotamian cities were bustling places, not silent monuments. Streets could be narrow and irregular, lined with homes, workshops, and storage rooms built close together to conserve space and protect against heat. Inside the houses, families often arranged courtyards that brought light and air into the center of domestic life. Trade and craft production filled many neighborhoods. Bakers, potters, weavers, metalworkers, and leatherworkers all contributed to the fabric of the city, often working in small family enterprises or attached to larger institutions. Markets would have carried a mix of sounds and smells: grain, oil, smoke, wool, copper, and animal life, all blending in the warm air. Though the details differ from city to city and period to period, we can imagine an urban environment both practical and intimate, where neighbors knew one another well, and where every shared wall reflected the closeness of ancient life. These cities were not only political centers, but also living ecosystems of labor, exchange, and social connection. Women in Mesopotamia held roles that varied widely depending on time, place, and social class. Some managed households, owned property, engaged in business, or served in religious institutions. Others worked in textile production, agriculture, or domestic tasks that sustained families and larger economies. Elite women could exercise significant influence, especially within royal and temple settings, though their power often operated through kinship, patronage, or ritual roles rather than formal office. The surviving records are uneven, and that makes the picture incomplete. Everyday women often appear only in legal texts, administrative lists, or court cases, not in personal narratives. Still, those fragments suggest a world more complex than a single simple pattern. Marriage contracts, inheritance disputes, and temple appointments reveal women navigating the structures around them with varying degrees of autonomy. In the quiet space between the documents, one can sense countless lives that were ordinary and singular at once, woven into the larger fabric of the society, though rarely preserved in full. Mesopotamian art favored clarity, symbolism, and repetition, though it also changed greatly across long centuries. Cylinder seals are among the most beautiful and intriguing objects from the region. Small and carefully carved, These cylinders were rolled across wet clay to create miniature scenes and official marks. They could show gods, animals, ritual moments, banqueting scenes, or abstract designs. Because they served as signatures and seals for documents, they were both practical and personal. Holding one in the hand, one might notice its cool weight and the precision of its carving, a private object that could leave a public imprint. Larger works in relief and sculpture also conveyed royal power and divine protection, often using rigid poses and repeated motifs rather than naturalistic detail. The art of Mesopotamia was not always aimed at realism. It was often meant to communicate status, sacred order, and narrative in a concise visual language. Through these images, modern viewers can glimpse how ancient people saw authority, reverence, and the patterned world around them. The armies and empires of Mesopotamia rose and fell across many centuries, but one of the most powerful was the Assyrian Empire, whose heartland lay in northern Mesopotamia. The Assyrians became famous for military organization, strategic expansion, and an administrative system that linked distant provinces to the imperial center. Their kings built grand palaces, commissioned elaborate reliefs, and recorded campaigns with an intensity that still feels vivid today. Yet empire was never only about war. It also depended on roads, messengers, governors, tribute, and the careful movement of resources. Cities like Nineveh and Asher became symbols of imperial authority, places where power was made visible in stone, inscription, and ceremony. Assyrian reliefs often depict sieges, hunting scenes, and processions, all arranged with an eye toward order and dominance. Even so, behind the monumental language of empire were ordinary workers, scribes, craftsmen, and agricultural communities supporting the machine of state. The grandeur can seem overwhelming, but it rested on a great deal of patience. In Mesopotamian cities, one of the most familiar sounds would have been the scrape of a stylus moving across wet clay. Long before paper, and long before books as we imagine them, scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into tablets that could be dried in the sun or baked in a kiln. The script, now called cuneiform, began as a practical accounting system, yet over time it became capable of recording myths, laws, prayers, royal boasts, contracts, omens, and letters. A single tablet might hold something as ordinary as a grain receipt, while another preserved the sorrowful poetry of a city in mourning. The clay itself was humble, but it carried extraordinary weight. Because baked tablets survive so well, many Mesopotamian voices still reach us after thousands of years, especially from cities where fire hardened archives instead of destroying them. This gives the region a feeling unlike many other ancient places. It is not only known through ruins and fragments, but through thousands upon thousands of texts, some tiny and rough, others carefully shaped with remarkable patience. Among the most famous of those texts are the great literary works that emerged from southern Mesopotamia, especially the stories surrounding Gilgamesh. The hero appears in versions that changed over centuries, which reminds us that Mesopotamian literature was not frozen in one form. It lived, copied by generations of scribes who often adapted older material for new audiences. The tale we call the Epic of Gilgamesh contains themes that feel deeply human even now: friendship, loss, fear of death, the search for meaning, and the limits of power. In one familiar episode, Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu confront Humbaba in the cedar forest, a place that seems distant and almost dreamlike, as if the narrative were opening outward into a world of mythic scale. Another passage includes a flood story that resembles later traditions in surrounding cultures, though the Mesopotamian version has its own character and setting. Scholars continue to compare the surviving tablets, noting differences between Old Babylonian and later standard versions. That ongoing study is a quiet reminder that the epic was not a single fixed book, but a living tradition, copied in schoolrooms and libraries over many centuries. Mesopotamian religion was equally layered, built not around one simple system, but around many local customs, divine families, temple rituals, and city identities. Each city often had a patron deity who was honored as the guardian of its welfare and prosperity. In Uruk, the goddess Inanna, also known later as Ishtar, stood among the most powerful and fascinating figures in the entire Mesopotamian pantheon. She was associated with love and fertility, but also with war, ambition, and sovereignty. Her image was not soft or distant. She could be brilliant, unsettling, and forceful, a deity who seemed to move between tenderness and violence with startling ease. Temples to the gods were not merely places of prayer. They were economic centers, administrative hubs, and symbolic homes for divine presence. Offerings of bread, beer, dates, sheep, and incense passed through these sacred spaces, blending devotion with the practical rhythms of daily survival. In a land where the floods and droughts could shape life so dramatically, religious ritual offered a structure of meaning, even if the gods themselves remained mysterious and powerful. In the royal cities, power was often displayed in architecture that tried to make human authority feel larger than human scale. Palaces and ceremonial complexes were built of mud brick, and though their walls have eroded over time, they once rose in imposing forms above the flat landscape. Relief carvings, painted plaster, and monumental gates announced the ambitions of kings who wanted their rule to seem ordered, enduring, and divinely approved. A famous example is the palace art of Assyria, where enormous stone reliefs showed hunting scenes, sieges, tribute-bearing envoys, and winged guardian figures with human faces and the bodies of bulls or lions. These images were meant to impress, but they also told stories about the world as rulers wished it to appear. A place where chaos was subdued, enemies were defeated, and the king stood at the center of cosmic balance. For modern viewers, the sharp lines of those carvings can feel almost still and silent, yet they were once part of a dynamic visual language. Lamps, painted details, and the movement of people through rooms would have animated them in ways the stones themselves can only faintly suggest now. The Mesopotamian world also depended on a remarkable agricultural intelligence. In a region where rainfall alone was not enough for dependable crops, irrigation had to be carefully managed. Canals, ditches, levees, and drainage channels linked settlements to rivers and fields, turning the seasonal rhythms of the Tigris and Euphrates into a human system of cultivation. This was not a simple triumph over nature, however. Water could bring abundance, but it could also bring salinization, flooding, and the slow deterioration of farmland. The maintenance of canals demanded cooperation, labor, and administrative oversight. Villagers, workers, and officials had to coordinate the timing of water flow, repair embankments, and keep the system functioning across long distances. Such work shaped society in profound ways. It helped encourage record-keeping, collective labor, and the growth of institutions that could organize resources. When we picture Mesopotamia, then, we might imagine not only temples and kings, but the quieter, sustained effort of people clearing silt from channels in the heat, listening to water move through the land, and knowing that a season's harvest might depend on careful hands and watchful planning. Mesopotamian law is often remembered through the famous Stele of Hammurabi, though legal practice in the region was broader and more flexible than one single monument suggests. The laws themselves were not necessarily a literal code used in every case, but they reveal the values and assumptions of Babylonian society. They describe marriage arrangements, property disputes, labor obligations, trade, injury, inheritance, and social rank. The distinctions between free persons, dependents, and enslaved individuals appear repeatedly, reminding us that Mesopotamian society was structured by clear hierarchies. Yet the documents surviving from ordinary court cases show that justice was also practical and local, shaped by contracts, witnesses, oaths, and administrative judgment. Many disputes concerned land boundaries, debt, or household responsibilities. It is easy to imagine the quiet atmosphere of a courthouse or temple office, with clay tablets being sealed and stored, while arguments were recorded in formal language. These texts give us a society that was deeply concerned with order, but not always simple order. It was a world where law served both ideal and negotiation, where the realities of family, labor, and status constantly filtered through official language. Trade connected Mesopotamia to lands far beyond the river valleys, carrying ideas as well as goods. The lowland cities had resources of their own, especially grain, wool, dates, and manufactured textiles, but they lacked other essentials such as timber, metals, and precious stones. So merchants and officials maintained networks reaching into Anatolia, the Levant, Iran, the Gulf, and beyond. Copper, tin, lapis lazuli, cedar wood, and shell all moved through these routes, often through many hands before arriving in a city market or temple storehouse. The process was slow and uncertain, shaped by geography, politics, and the dangers of travel. Donkeys, boats, and caravans formed a connective tissue between distant regions. Along with physical objects, styles of art, myth, and administrative practice also traveled. Mesopotamia was never isolated, even in its earliest periods. It was a place of exchange, a crossroads where local traditions absorbed foreign materials and transformed them into something distinctly their own. That sense of connection is one reason the region feels so central to world history. It was not standing apart from other civilizations, but interacting with them from an early date in a dense and continual flow. The everyday homes of Mesopotamia were generally made from mud brick, a material that suited the available environment and could be produced with relative ease. These houses were often arranged around courtyards that provided light, air, and a private center for household life. Outer walls were mostly plain, while the interior contained storage rooms, living spaces, cooking areas, and sometimes stairways to upper levels or rooftops. In a hot climate, thick walls and enclosed spaces helped moderate the temperature. Families would have carried out many tasks in the shaded courtyard, from preparing food to mending cloth or grinding grain. Roofs may have been used for sleeping on warm nights or for drying goods, depending on season and household custom. Archaeology can reveal the outlines of these homes, but the intimate sounds of domestic life are harder to recover. The soft chatter of family members, the clatter of pottery, the smell of baking bread, the dust rising in an afternoon breeze. Even so, the houses show that Mesopotamian civilization was built not only by kings and priests, but by ordinary households whose repeated routines made city life possible. Writing and schooling formed another important layer of urban life. To become a scribe took time, discipline, and access to training. Students learned lists of signs, vocabulary, proverbs, and model texts, often copying and recopying until the forms became familiar. Some school tablets preserve mistakes, corrections, and exercises, which make the learning process feel remarkably immediate. One can imagine a young student pressing a sign too deeply, smoothing the clay, trying again, or memorizing lines aloud while an instructor watched. Scribal education created a literate class capable of handling administration, diplomacy, and literature. It also helped preserve continuity across generations, because written tradition could outlast the people who first composed it. Yet scribal culture was not static or purely formal. Humor, repetition, and playful lists appear in the record as well. Mesopotamian schools could be strict, but they were also places where language itself became a craft, shaped by rhythm, memory, and the tactile intelligence of clay. As Mesopotamian history unfolded, empires rose and fell, each adding another layer to the long record of the region. Sumerian city-states, Akkadian kings, Babylonian dynasties, Assyrian expansions, and later powers all left their traces. None erased what came before. Instead, they inherited temples, texts, administrative habits, divine names, and artistic forms, then adapted them in new political contexts. This continuity. In the long, folded history of Mesopotamia, one of the most enduring ideas was that life belonged to the gods, and that humans were made to serve, maintain, and honor the sacred order. This belief was not just poetic language, it shaped the rhythms of work, worship, and kingship. Temples were not only places for prayer, but great economic centers, gathering grain, textiles, livestock, and labor. The land itself was often imagined as a gift that had to be managed carefully, because the rivers that nourished it could also flood unpredictably or retreat into dust. In that sense, Mesopotamian civilization was always balancing between abundance and anxiety. The people who lived there understood that prosperity depended on careful observation, patient record-keeping, and the favor of powers seen and unseen. It is one reason their culture produced so many lists, omens, inventories, and ritual instructions. Even the simple act of naming something could feel like a way of placing it into a larger, divinely ordered world. That sense of order extended into the city itself, where streets, courtyards, and temple precincts created a layered social landscape. Mesopotamian cities were not built all at once in some single grand design, but slowly accumulated over generations, becoming dense with mud brick walls, household compounds, and sacred buildings. Walking through one of these cities would have meant moving through sound and smell as much as stone or clay. There would be the soft scrape of sandals on packed earth, the chatter of markets, the clatter of jars, the lowing of animals, and the smoke from ovens and hearths. In hot weather, the walls would have held onto the day's warmth long after sunset. Water channels and wells gave life to neighborhoods, while narrow lanes offered shade where people could pass close to one another. The city was not a silent monument. It was a living, breathing concentration of families, merchants, officials, priests, and craft workers, all tied together by the needs of trade, irrigation, and seasonal labor. One of the quieter marvels of Mesopotamia was the way its people turned mud into permanence. Clay was everywhere, and they used it for tablets, bricks, figurines, ceilings, drainage systems, and storage containers. Sun-dried mud brick was the standard building material for homes and even many public structures, while baked brick was used where greater durability was needed. Because stone and timber were relatively scarce in much of the region, clay became a kind of foundation for civilization itself. This meant that many buildings had to be repaired, replastered, and rebuilt over time, layer upon layer, almost like sedimentary history made visible in architecture. Even writing belonged to this clay world. Scribes pressed wedge-shaped signs into damp tablets, recording transactions, prayers, laws, and stories. A tablet might be small enough to rest in the palm of a hand, yet it could preserve information for thousands of years. The softness of the clay before it hardened made knowledge feel both fragile and enduring at once. Among the most remarkable figures in Mesopotamian society was the scribe, a person trained to read, write, calculate, and manage the complicated demands of administration. Scribes occupied a special place because writing was difficult to master, and not everyone could be expected to learn it. Their schooling required patience, repetition, and discipline, often beginning in childhood. Students copied signs over and over, memorized lexical lists, and practiced handling numbers, measures, and formulaic texts. Some tablets from ancient schools still bear the marks of mistakes, corrections, and student exercises, offering a surprisingly intimate glimpse into education thousands of years ago. Through this training, scribes became the keepers of memory for the state and the temple. They were needed for receipts, tax lists, contracts, legal matters, and correspondence. In a world without printing or digital storage, they were the human infrastructure of information, sitting quietly at the center of trade and governance, their reed pens moving across the clay with deliberate care. Trade, in turn, connected Mesopotamia to lands far beyond the river plains. The region had grain, date palms, wool, and a sophisticated urban economy, but it lacked certain essential materials, including high-quality stone, metals, and timber. So merchants and rulers reached outward. Copper could come from Oman or other distant zones, tin from even farther away, and cedar wood from the mountains of Lebanon. These exchanges required caravans, boats, agreements, and trust maintained over long distances. Ports and river routes carried goods from one city to another, while overland paths linked Mesopotamia to Anatolia, the Levant, the Iranian plateau, and beyond. The flow of goods was also the flow of ideas. Seals, styles of dress, artistic motifs, and administrative habits traveled with merchants and envoys. Mesopotamia was never an isolated world. It was a junction, a place where different landscapes and peoples met and transformed one another in slow, practical ways. Religious life also traveled through these networks, yet it remained rooted in the local landscape of each city. Every major city had its patron deity, and that god or goddess was often understood as the true owner and protector of the community. A city's identity could be inseparable from its divine household. Temples served as the earthly residence of these deities, and festivals marked the seasons with ritual processions, offerings, music, and prayer. The gods were thought to require attention, just as humans did, though on a grander scale. Food was presented, garments were dedicated, incense was burned, and statues were cared for as if they were living beings. Scholars sometimes speak of this as cult, but the word can sound distant. In practice, it meant a deep daily relationship with the sacred, maintained through repeated actions. These rituals helped stabilize society because they tied political authority, agricultural abundance, and cosmic well-being together into a single pattern of care. As the great empires of Mesopotamia rose and fell, one thing that remained constant was the importance of the city of Babylon in the cultural imagination. Babylon became more than a capital. It became a symbol, a place associated with splendor, learning, and divine favor, especially under the Neo-Babylonian kings. Massive walls, ceremonial gates, and grand temples created an atmosphere of awe. The city's rebuilt sanctuaries and processional routes suggested a world carefully arranged for ritual and power. Yet Babylon also exists for us through texts, and texts can magnify as much as they describe. Ancient authors, later historians, and even enemies of Babylon all contributed to its legend. So while the city was certainly impressive, part of its fame came from the stories people told about it. In that blend of archaeology and memory, Babylon stands as one of the great names of the ancient world, glowing softly through the surviving fragments. Another enduring feature of Mesopotamian life was the careful observation of the heavens. The night sky mattered deeply because people believed celestial movements could reveal patterns in the world below. Stars, planets, eclipses, and unusual atmospheric events were all watched with intense attention. Over time, Mesopotamian scholars built detailed records of what they saw, especially in later periods when astronomy and astrology became highly developed. They tracked cycles, predicted phenomena, and connected celestial signs with earthly events. Some of this work was practical, helping with calendars and seasonal planning. Some of it was religious, woven into omens and divination. It is striking how patient this observation was. Generations of scribes and scholars looked upward night after night, not in a rush, but with quiet discipline. Their records would eventually become part of the foundation of scientific astronomy, yet they began in a world where the sky was also a sacred text, full of meaning to be read carefully. The law codes of Mesopotamia are often remembered as grand symbols of order, especially the famous laws associated with Hammurabi. But law in Mesopotamia was not just a stone monument covered in official language. It was also a living system of contracts, testimonies, disputes, and administrative decisions. Families bought and sold property, adopted children, hired workers, and made marriage agreements through written documents. Judges, elders, and officials helped settle conflicts, sometimes drawing on custom, precedent, and royal authority. The famous law collections were idealized texts, presenting justice as something the king received from the gods and then distributed to his people. Yet everyday legal practice was more flexible and local than a single stone inscription might suggest. That tension between the ideal and the actual gives Mesopotamian law its human depth. It was an effort to create fairness in a complicated world, where crops failed, debts accumulated, and personal relationships could be as important as written rules. In domestic life, the household was the basic unit of survival and identity. A Mesopotamian home might include a central courtyard, rooms for storage and sleeping, cooking spaces, and areas for craftwork or small-scale trade. Families lived with a constant awareness of season, water, and food supply. Bread, beer, onions, fish, dates, and barley formed much of the diet, though the details varied by time and place. Women played important roles in household labor, textile production, food preparation, and family continuity, while men also participated in domestic and economic tasks. Children grew up in environments where work and learning were closely intertwined. The house was not separate from the economy, it was one of its main engines. Even religious practice entered the home through small altars, protective figurines, and daily rituals meant to guard against illness or misfortune. In this intimate world, survival was collective, built from repeated small acts, from grinding grain to fetching water to mending cloth in the evening light. And beneath all of it, beneath empire and temple, trade and law, there was the ever-present river landscape itself. Mesopotamia existed in the space between the Tigris and Euphrates, but those rivers were never just a backdrop. They were dynamic, sometimes generous, sometimes dangerous, always shaping human choices. Irrigation canals extended the reach of agriculture, turning dry ground into productive fields, yet they also required coordination, maintenance, and constant labor. Silt had to be cleared, embankments repaired, water distributed fairly. A canal broken in one place could affect whole communities. This meant that Mesopotamian civilization was, in a very real sense, an achievement of. Even in a land so often imagined through its kings and temples, daily life was shaped by practical things, and one of the most quietly important was the humble clay tablet. In Mesopotamia, writing did not live only in grand inscriptions carved for eternity. It also lived in the soft, damp rectangles of clay that could be pressed with a reed stylus and set out in the sun to dry. These tablets might record deliveries of grain, legal disputes, temple inventories, tax obligations, school exercises, letters between merchants, or prayers copied by hand. Their survival is part accident, part climate, because baked clay endures long after reeds, leather, and papyrus have vanished. Thousands of years later, the tablets still carry the texture of fingertips and reed marks, as if the people who made them had only just set them down. Some are neatly formed by trained scribes, while others are hurried, crooked, or smudged, reminding us that administration was not always polished, and that ancient bureaucracy could feel as human and imperfect as any modern office. The schools where scribes learned this difficult craft were called tablet houses in later tradition, and they were often demanding, disciplined places. A student had to memorize lists, copy signs again and again, and learn the many ways a sign could change meaning depending on context. Writing cuneiform was not simply a matter of learning an alphabet. It was a system of wedges and combinations that could represent sounds, words, names, and ideas, sometimes all within the same text. A single tablet exercise might show the repetition of a sign line after line, the ancient equivalent of copying curves or strokes until the hand no longer hesitated. Teachers corrected mistakes with a sharpness that still appears in the tablets themselves. Some school tablets preserve a student's failed attempts beside the corrected version, and there is something intimate in that preserved struggle. It suggests that education in Mesopotamia was both exacting and deeply practical, preparing young scribes for the ordered world of temples, palaces, and trade. That world depended heavily on the river system, but not all parts of Mesopotamia were equally lush or predictable. The Tigris and Euphrates could be nourishing, yet their behavior was often less gentle than the more regular river cycles of Egypt. Floods might arrive at inconvenient times, washing away fields rather than simply refreshing them. The region also relied on canals, dikes, and careful maintenance to guide water where it was needed. Irrigation was a collective achievement, requiring labor, planning, and authority. Canal silt had to be cleared, banks had to be repaired, gates and channels had to be watched. A settlement could prosper only if water management remained attentive and coordinated. In a very real sense, the civilization was built not only on fertile soil, but on the constant negotiation between human effort and the unpredictable movements of water. Even now, when historians study Mesopotamian cities, they often see traces of how crucial this management was in the layout of fields, the placement of settlements, and the records of labor assigned to canal work. Among the most revealing texts from Mesopotamia are not royal victories or divine hymns, but legal documents. These tablets preserve contracts for land sales, marriage arrangements, loans, adoption agreements, inheritance disputes, and penalties for broken obligations. A world emerges from them that is formal, careful, and astonishingly detailed. People borrowed silver at interest. They pledged houses or fields as security. They adopted heirs when families had no children of their own. They negotiated dowries. They sought witnesses. They wrote down terms because memory could fail and because law once recorded had a sturdier presence. The documents do not always reveal justice in the modern sense, and they certainly reflect social inequality, but they do show a society that valued written proof. A line impressed into clay could help settle a dispute long after the participants were gone. In that way, the tablets were not just records of life. They were instruments meant to hold life in place, to keep the terms of a promise from dissolving into memory. The city of Babylon became, over time, one of the great names of Mesopotamia, and its fame grew partly because it was more than a city. It became an idea. For some ancient peoples, Babylon represented power, learning, divine favor, and the center of a vast political world. Its monumental architecture, especially during later periods, must have appeared dazzling in the bright sun, with glazed bricks reflecting color and light across processional streets and temples. Yet Babylon's importance was not only ceremonial, it was also administrative and intellectual. Astronomers, priests, and scribes worked there across generations, observing the heavens, calculating calendars, and preserving tradition. The city became a place where scholarship could accumulate, where older knowledge might be recited, revised, and copied. Later writers would remember Babylon with awe, fear, and nostalgia, sometimes at the same time. The city's long life made it feel almost like a character in history rather than a mere location, a living center whose walls and names outlasted many dynasties. The heavens above Mesopotamia inspired careful watching, and among the most remarkable achievements of its scholars was their patient recording of celestial events. They tracked the moon, the movement of planets, eclipses, and unusual omens with extraordinary attention. Not all of this work was science in the modern sense, because observation was often tied to divination and state concerns. An eclipse could be interpreted as a sign affecting a king. A bright star might be read as a warning or blessing. Still, the records themselves were remarkably precise. Over long periods, scribes noticed patterns and cycles. They learned to predict some events with impressive accuracy. Their lists of observations, copied across generations, became part of a broader intellectual tradition that blended religion, mathematics, and empirical attention. On a quiet night in an ancient courtyard, one can imagine a scholar tilting his head upward, waiting as the moon's shape changes slowly over the dark sky, while a reed stylus and tablet stand ready to capture what he sees. The sky was not only beautiful to Mesopotamians, it was legible, meaningful, and deeply connected to earthly affairs. Religious life in Mesopotamia was equally layered, and temples were not simply places of worship. They were economic centers, ceremonial stages, and symbols of civic order. In many cities, a temple could own land, employ workers, receive offerings, and store goods. Priests and temple administrators managed livestock, grain, textiles, and labor records. The deity at the center of the temple was understood not as a distant abstraction, but as a living presence housed in the god's statue and supported through ritual care. Food offerings were prepared. Incense may have drifted through sacred rooms. Hymns and processions reaffirmed the bond between divine power and the city. Different cities honored different principal gods, and those local religious identities could be strong. At the same time, Mesopotamian religion was not rigidly fixed. Ritual practices changed over centuries, and the names of gods merged, shifted, and interacted across regions. This gives the spiritual world of Mesopotamia a gently layered quality, like sediment in clay, where older beliefs remain visible even as newer forms settle on top. If temples represented sacred order, palaces represented political authority, though the two were never entirely separate. Kingship in Mesopotamia was often presented as supported by divine favor, but rulers still had to demonstrate effectiveness through war, building, justice, and administration. Palaces were not always the extravagant stone structures sometimes imagined from later empires. In many periods, they were extensive complexes of mud brick rooms, courtyards, storerooms, archives, workshops, and audience halls. They housed officials, servants, guards, craftsmen, and records. A king's authority extended through messengers and provincial governors, through tribute and taxation, through the distribution of food and clothing. Inscriptions frequently describe the ruler as the builder of walls, canals, and temples, as if construction itself were proof of good government. Yet the day-to-day reality of power likely depended on countless intermediaries. A palace was therefore less a single throne room than a whole administrative ecosystem, humming with movement, paperwork, and controlled access. Trade reached far beyond the alluvial plains, tying Mesopotamia to distant lands through long and uncertain routes. Timber, stone, metals, lapis lazuli, shell, and other valuable materials were imported from regions that lacked the resources found in river cities. In exchange, Mesopotamians exported grain, textiles, crafted goods, and administrative skill. Merchants were essential figures, operating with caravans, river transport, and commercial contacts that stretched across vast spaces. Some travels were local, some longer and more risky. Documentation suggests firms or trading houses where family and business merged closely. A merchant might entrust goods to another agent, wait for a return shipment, and then settle accounts by tablet. Trade required trust, but it also required record-keeping and patience because distance introduced uncertainty. A boat could sink, a caravan could delay, markets could shift. In the silence of an archive, these transactions remain as brief notations of human ambition, carrying the quiet weight of journeys not fully seen. Mesopotamian art often reveals a world of symbols, especially in cylinder seals, those small carved stones rolled over clay to leave continuous designs. These seals were practical tools used to mark ownership or authority, but they were also tiny works of art, packed with figures, animals, deities, combat scenes, and ritual imagery. A seal might be worn on the body and used daily, its engravings worn smooth by handling. Some show kings receiving divine approval. Others depict banquets, hunting, or protective creatures arranged with striking symmetry. Because they were rolled rather than stamped, cylinder seals created a moving image, a miniature narrative unspooling across clay. There is something especially delicate about them, as if Mesopotamian visual culture enjoyed compressing large ideas into small forms. A person carrying a seal carried identity, status, and a kind of portable signature. In a world of documents and storage rooms, such a tiny object could carry extraordinary authority, closing a jar, a door, or a contract with a visible mark of legitimacy. And behind the rise and fall of dynasties, behind the palaces, laws, and temples, there were ordinary homes. In many Mesopotamian homes, the heart of daily life was not a grand palace or a towering temple, but a simple, private courtyard that opened to the sky. Around this open space, people cooked, ate, worked, and gathered in the evening air. The arrangement offered shade in the day and a little relief when the heat settled over the land, and it also created a quiet kind of privacy in the middle of crowded cities. Archaeologists sometimes find these houses built of mud brick, with rooms arranged around the courtyard, like gentle spokes around a still center. It is easy to imagine the sound of water being poured into a basin, the soft shuffle of sandals on packed earth, and the smell of bread or stew rising from clay pots. In a region where the sun could be fierce, the courtyard was more than architecture. It was a calm, breathing space, a small climate of its own, where family life unfolded slowly beneath the open sky. That domestic world depended on something even more essential: water management. Across Mesopotamia, people learned to live with rivers that could nourish fields and also bring disaster when they shifted or flooded. So they built canals, levees, ditches, and drainage systems, some carefully planned by local communities and some directed by kings who claimed to command the land itself. The work of maintaining water channels was never finished. Silt collected, banks weakened, and routes had to be reopened season after season. This constant labor shaped the rhythm of the society. It required cooperation, accounting, and a great deal of practical knowledge. Farmers had to know when water should be diverted, when it should be held back, and how to keep saline buildup from ruining the soil. The result was a landscape that was partly natural and partly constructed, a living partnership between river and hand. Even today, the remains of ancient channels hint at a world where survival depended on patient attention to flowing water. And because water, land, and harvest were so closely linked, Mesopotamian people kept careful track of time through the seasons. Their calendars were often lunar, built around the changing face of the moon, yet they also had to stay connected to the agricultural year. This meant that months, festivals, and rituals were tied to work in the fields, to planting and reaping, to moments when the land seemed to wake or rest. Some of the oldest textual traditions show a strong interest in timing, in omen, and in patterns that could help people anticipate what might happen next. The sky itself was watched with devotion. Eclipses, planetary movements, and unusual storms were all interpreted in ways that mixed observation with belief. In a world where weather could alter everything, time was not abstract. It was felt in the body, in the hands, in the soil, and in the uncertainty of each new season. Writing, too, emerged from that practical world of record-keeping and shared memory. The earliest cuneiform signs were not beginning as poetry or literature, but as marks for counting grain, tracking labor, listing animals, and organizing offerings. Over time, these wedge-shaped impressions pressed into clay became one of the great intellectual achievements of the ancient world. The clay tablets themselves were small and ordinary-looking, yet they carried debts, laws, hymns, legal agreements, school exercises, and stories that outlived the people who wrote them. The texture of the clay mattered. Wet clay could be shaped quickly, and then it could harden in the sun or fire, preserving the words like a fossil of thought. Scribes trained for years to learn the signs, copying lists and texts until the system became second nature. Their work was quiet and exacting, and it allowed Mesopotamia to build institutions that depended on memory outside the human mind. A tablet could hold a shipment, a contract, or a prayer, and then wait patiently for centuries. Among the many things preserved in these tablets are the legal and social customs that governed daily life. Mesopotamian law codes are often remembered for their dramatic punishments, but they also reveal a society trying to manage complexity. Questions of inheritance, marriage, injury, theft, slavery, debt, and property all had to be addressed. The famous law collections associated with rulers like Hammurabi may not have functioned exactly like modern law books, but they show how public authority wanted to present itself as a force for order, judgment, and fairness, even if that fairness was unequal by our standards. Social rank mattered greatly. Free people, dependents, slaves, men, women, and children did not stand on the same ground before the law. Yet the very existence of these legal texts tells us that conflict was common enough to require rules, and that urban life was complicated enough to need formal resolution. In these documents, we can almost hear the measured tone of officials trying to impose calm on a world of disputes. Religious life was equally woven into everyday structure, though it often took place in impressive temple precincts that rose above the city. Temples were not only sacred spaces. They were centers of administration, storage, and ritual economy. Offerings of food, beer, oil, and livestock moved through their courtyards. Priests and temple workers managed land, recorded supplies, and performed ceremonies for gods who were understood to sustain the city's life. One of the most moving features of Mesopotamian religion is how intimate it could be. Gods were powerful, but they were also imagined as participating in a human-like network of care, obligation, and favor. Statues of deities were dressed, fed symbolically, and treated as living presences. Festivals brought music, incense, processions, and public gatherings that likely filled the air with a layered mixture of smoke, animal scent, reeds, and dust. These rituals may have felt solemn, but they were also part of a recurring order that reassured people that the world still had structure. Some of the most enduring Mesopotamian stories explore what it meant to live under that order. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in particular, stands as a meditation on kingship, friendship, sorrow, and the limits of human life. It is ancient, but it feels remarkably close to the emotional questions people still ask. Gilgamesh's journey begins in power and restlessness, moves through the grief of losing his companion Enkidu, and turns toward the painful realization that immortality is not granted to mortals. The story survives in fragmented versions from different periods, which gives it a layered, almost dreamlike quality. It is not just a single text, but a tradition that changed over time. In its surviving form, it pauses over city walls, over wild landscapes, over the flood, over the ache of forgetting. That emotional depth suggests that Mesopotamian literature was not only about kings and gods. It was also about vulnerability, about the quiet recognition that every life is temporary, no matter how high its walls or how loud its fame. That sense of fragility may help explain why omens and divination were so deeply respected. Mesopotamian scholars believed that the gods communicated through signs, and they developed highly elaborate systems for reading those signs in the liver of a sacrificed animal, in the motion of stars, in the shape of smoke, or in strange occurrences within daily life. This was not casual superstition, but a serious scholarly tradition with specialists, tablets, and technical vocabulary. Some texts read almost like reference manuals for uncertainty. If a certain marking appeared on a liver, what might it mean for the king? If a star rose in a certain way, what could it predict about war, flood, or famine? The aim was not perfect certainty, because perfect certainty was not available. The aim was guidance. In a world exposed to shifting rivers and shifting politics, divination offered a language for interpreting risk. It gave form to anxiety and perhaps a small measure of calm. The artistic life of Mesopotamia also reflected this blend of practical skill and symbolic meaning. Cylinder seals, for instance, were tiny carved objects rolled across wet clay to leave detailed impressions. They served as signatures, identifiers, and markers of authority, but they were also miniature works of art. Many show banquets, divine scenes, animals, worshippers, and mythical creatures arranged in elegant, repeating patterns. Because they were carried and used daily, they slipped quietly into ordinary routines, pressing image into administration with every role. There was something deeply intimate about them. A seal was personal, portable, and often beautifully made, yet it functioned in the business of receipts, storage jars, and legal control. Even now, their fine lines can still be studied under soft light, revealing the care of ancient hands and the preferences of long-forgotten owners. They are small objects, but they open a large window into Mesopotamian social life. Trade connected all of these worlds, bringing in materials the river valleys did not naturally provide. Mesopotamia had abundant clay, reeds, and grain, but it needed timber, stone, metal, and precious stones from farther away. So merchants traveled over land and water, linking cities to Anatolia, the Levant, Iran, the Gulf, and beyond. Some routes were local and seasonal, others stretched into complex networks of exchange. Caravans and boats carried copper, lapis lazuli, wool, textiles, oil, and finished goods. Trade was not always smooth or fair, and the records show disputes, taxes, contracts, and risks. Still, the flow of goods helped shape Mesopotamian prosperity and cultural openness. Cities became places where languages, materials, and customs met. A piece of imported stone or a foreign bead could carry with it the memory of distance. In this sense, commerce was not only economic, it was also a quiet widening of the world, a reminder that even in a land of rivers, life was tied to paths far beyond the horizon. And through all these changes, Mesopotamian cities remained environments of remarkable continuity and reinvention. Uruk, Nippur, Babylon, Ashur, Nineveh, and many others rose to prominence at different times, each with its own political fortunes and sacred associations. One city might flourish while another declined, yet the broader cultural world persisted through language, scribal tradition, temple ritual, and memory. Walls were rebuilt, dynasties changed, empires expanded. By the time the great city of Babylon had become one of the most famous places in the ancient world, its fame was tied not only to kings and walls, but also to memory itself. Long after the old Babylonian Empire had faded, people in Mesopotamia continued to look back on older rulers as if they belonged to a golden age. Names like Sargon of Akkad, Hammurabi, and the powerful kings of Assyria were copied, quoted, and remembered in later texts with a sense of awe. This habit of remembering the past was itself a kind of cultural achievement. In a land where cities rose and declined repeatedly, history was not something distant and fixed. It was living material, reshaped by priests, scholars, and scribes who believed the deeds of earlier kings still carried meaning. Clay tablets preserved old omens, royal inscriptions, and stories of heroic success, so that later generations could study the past as a guide to the present. Even when exact dates were uncertain, the Mesopotamians understood that older times held authority. Their world was layered with memory, and each city seemed to stand on the residue of many older lives, buried one over another beneath the soil. This long memory was closely connected to the scribal schools, where boys, and sometimes a few girls, learned the difficult art of writing cuneiform. These schools, often called tablet houses by modern scholars, were quiet places of discipline, repetition, and inkless patience. Students pressed reed styluses into soft clay, learning to copy lists of words, proverbs, contracts, and model letters again and again. It was a demanding education because cuneiform was not a simple alphabet, but a complex system of signs with many possible meanings and sounds. A single sign could represent a syllable, a word, or an idea, depending on context. The work of a scribe required not just literacy but memory, precision, and a calm hand. Archaeologists have found exercise tablets covered in corrections, showing how often students made mistakes and then smoothed the clay to try again. The school curriculum included mathematics, legal formulas, literary texts, and administrative training, because scribes were essential to temples, palaces, trade, and taxation. In a sense, they were the keepers of civilization's paperwork, and through them the practical life of Mesopotamia was written into permanence. Among the texts that scribes copied, some of the most fascinating are the old stories of flood, creation, and divine judgment. Mesopotamia was a land shaped by rivers that could nourish or destroy, and it is not surprising that water appears so often in its mythology. One famous tale tells of a great flood sent by the gods, from which a single righteous man survives by building a boat and preserving living creatures. Versions of this story appear in the Atrahasis epic and in the later epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood survivor speaks with the weary wisdom of one who has seen the world remade. Scholars often compare these Mesopotamian flood traditions with later biblical accounts, though the relationships between them are complex and debated. What matters most is that the story reflects an ancient understanding of nature as powerful, unpredictable, and deeply entwined with divine will. The rivers that made fields fertile could also rise with devastating force. In that sense, the flood stories are not only religious myths, but also emotional records of life beside unstable waters, where safety was always something borrowed from the gods. Mesopotamian religion was not built around a single holy book or one central doctrine. Instead, it was a broad and changing landscape of rituals, temples, hymns, and local traditions. Each city had its own chief deities, though many gods were worshipped across the region. In the southern cities, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, and Nanna were especially important, while later periods elevated Marduk in Babylon and Ashur in Assyria. Temples were not merely places of prayer. They were economic institutions, landowners, storerooms, and ritual centers, alive with offerings, incense, chanting, and the movement of workers. The priests and priestesses maintained daily routines of cleansing statues, presenting food, and reciting hymns. To the Mesopotamians, divine presence was not abstract. A god could dwell in a temple image, in a sacred object, or in the order of a well-performed ceremony. The atmosphere of religion was therefore practical as well as spiritual. One imagines the cool shadow of temple courtyards, the smell of grain and oil, the low murmur of prayers, and the sense that the balance of the cosmos depended on careful human action. Another striking feature of Mesopotamian life was the importance of divination, the effort to read the will of the gods through signs. People believed that the world was filled with messages. A strange birth, an unusual dream, the shape of a liver examined during ritual sacrifice, the behavior of animals, or the movement of the stars could all be interpreted as omens. Scholars known as exorcists and diviners collected huge compendia of signs and their meanings, creating one of the ancient world's richest traditions of interpretive knowledge. Some of this may seem strange now, but to Mesopotamian thinkers, it represented a disciplined attempt to understand a universe that was both ordered and mysterious. Kings relied on diviners before campaigns and major decisions. If an omen was unfavorable, rituals might be repeated, delayed, or redirected. In this way, uncertainty became part of governance. The world was not assumed to be random, but neither was it fully transparent. Human beings lived by reading patterns, listening carefully, and accepting that the gods communicated in a language that required study. Trade connected Mesopotamia to distant lands and gave the region a broader horizon than its flat plains might suggest. Because southern Mesopotamia lacked many essential raw materials, merchants and rulers reached outward in every direction. They imported timber from the mountains of Lebanon, precious stones from Iran and Afghanistan, copper from Oman and beyond, and sometimes even luxury items from the Indus Valley. In return, they exported grain, textiles, oil, and crafted goods. Long-distance trade was never simple. It depended on caravans, riverboats, contracts, seals, and trusted intermediaries. Seals made of stone or shell were pressed into clay to mark property and authenticate transactions, becoming tiny but powerful tools of administration. The movement of goods created contact between peoples, languages, and artistic styles. Mesopotamia was therefore not an isolated cradle, but a crossroads, a place whose cities were fed by exchange. The rhythms of this commerce may have felt very ordinary to the people involved, with accounts to settle and journeys to plan, yet from a wider perspective, these networks helped shape one of the earliest interconnected worlds. As the centuries passed, Assyria emerged as one of the most formidable powers in the Near East. Its heartland lay farther north, and its kings developed a military system that was both highly organized and deeply intimidating. They built roads, relay stations, forts, and administrative networks that allowed armies to move with speed and coordination. Siege warfare became one of their specialities, and Assyrian reliefs show battering rams, archers, scaling ladders, and disciplined troops advancing against fortified cities. These images were not only records of battle, but also messages of imperial confidence. The kings wanted viewers to feel the force of royal power. Yet beneath the terrifying surface, Assyria was also a state of record-keeping and bureaucracy. Officers sent reports, collected tribute, and monitored provinces. The empire's might was sustained by paperwork as much as by swords. At its height, Assyria governed a vast territory with remarkable efficiency, though at great human cost. Subject peoples were relocated, taxed, and sometimes brutally suppressed. The splendor of the palace and the terror of the campaign belonged to the same political order, one that left behind both brilliant art and a long trail of fear. In the later Babylonian period, learning and scholarship reached an especially refined form. Scholars copied astronomical observations over generations, building records that allowed them to predict celestial events with impressive accuracy. They tracked the moon, planets, eclipses, and seasonal cycles, not as detached scientists in a modern sense, but as interpreters of a meaningful sky. The heavens were part of a sacred and ordered cosmos. Babylonian astronomers developed sophisticated mathematical methods, and their tables and calculations would eventually influence later Greek and Islamic astronomy. Yet the work was also intensely practical. Predicting lunar phases helped organize calendars, festivals, and agricultural planning. The sky above Mesopotamia, clear and immense over the plains, invited patient observation. Night after night, scholars may have sat with tablets and styluses, recording what they saw by lamplight. There is something peaceful in imagining this slow attention to the heavens, a tradition of watching and measuring that stretched across centuries and linked human life to the larger movements of time. The city of Babylon itself became a symbol larger than its physical streets. Ancient sources describe its massive walls, its processional avenues, its great temples, and the legendary splendor of its gates. Some later traditions even placed the Hanging Gardens there, though scholars continue to debate whether this wonder truly existed in Babylon or belonged to another place or a literary imagination. What is certain is that Babylon came to represent urban magnificence, royal ambition, and the possibility of a world city. The god Marduk was honored there as Babylon rose in power, and the city's festivals, especially the New Year celebrations, tied divine kingship to civic identity. During those ceremonies, statues, processions, and recitations reinforced the idea that Babylon was not just a capital, but a sacred center. To walk through such a city, with its brick walls gleaming in the sun and its streets filled with traders, priests, laborers, and officials, would have been to experience the ancient Near East in concentrated form. Babylon lived in the imagination because it was built to be remembered. As Mesopotamian civilization eventually gave way to new empires, its languages did not vanish all at once. Akkadian, written in cuneiform, survived for centuries as a scholarly and administrative language, even after everyday speech changed. Later, Aramaic spread widely and became the common language of many people across the region. This shift is one of the quieter transformations. The great ziggurats of Mesopotamia were not simply tall buildings, but carefully ordered stairways toward the divine, rising in broad terraces above the flat lands of the river valleys. To stand near one would have meant seeing sun-baked mud brick, bitumen mortar, and painted surfaces catching the harsh light, while priests and laborers moved along ramps with offerings, tools, and baskets of earth. The exact appearance of each ziggurat is still partly uncertain, because time, erosion, and later rebuilding changed them again and again, but the idea itself is clear enough. These were sacred platforms meant to separate the ordinary world from the realm of the gods, and at the summit often stood a shrine that may have been reserved for ritual use, not for crowds. In some cities, a ziggurat could symbolize the bond between a city's identity and its patron deity, making stone and brick into a kind of public prayer. Even now, ruined stairways in the dust can feel strangely quiet, as though they still remember the feet that once climbed them in the dawn. Mesopotamian scribes were among the earliest people to turn writing into a daily profession, and their training could be long, exacting, and a little severe. A student might begin by pressing signs into wet clay with a reed stylus, copying lists of words, proverbs, accounts, and literary texts until the shapes became second nature. Some tablets show corrections, erased marks, or repeated exercises, which gives us a small glimpse into the slow discipline of learning. The schoolhouse, often imagined as a place of stern instruction, was also a place where knowledge accumulated in layers, much like the river silt that nourished the fields outside. Scribes learned not only how to write but how to measure grain, record legal agreements, interpret omens, and preserve myths. Their work was practical and sacred at once, since a tablet could hold both a delivery receipt and a hymn to a god. Through them, memory became physical, cool, and weighty in the hand. Among the more delicate traces of Mesopotamian life are the small personal seals used to mark ownership and authority. These were often cylinder seals, carved with tiny scenes of worship, animals, battles, feasts, or divine symbols, and when rolled across wet clay, they left a continuous image like a miniature moving story. Each seal was both practical and intimate, a kind of signature that could close a jar, secure a document, or identify a storage room. The stone or shell used to make them might have come from distant places, suggesting trade networks that stretched far beyond the river plains. Some seals are so finely cut that a viewer has to lean close to see the figures clearly, almost entering the compressed world inside the engraving. Scholars still debate the exact meaning of every scene, because some images may have had layered symbolic meanings we can no longer fully recover. Yet the seals remain eloquent in their own quiet way, showing a society where identity could be pressed into clay and then dried into permanence. Food in Mesopotamia was ordinary in one sense and remarkably sophisticated in another. Bread appears constantly in texts, and there were likely many forms of it, from simple flat loaves to richer baked goods flavored with oil, dates, or herbs. Beer was equally important, not merely as a luxury, but as a daily staple made from barley, filtered and consumed in various strengths. The famous hymns and administrative tablets together suggest a world where meals were central to labor, ritual, and hospitality. Workers might receive grain, oil, fish, and beer as rations, while temple offerings could include more elaborate platters prepared for the gods. The smell of baking would have drifted from household hearths and public ovens, mingling with the scent of malted grain and simmering stews. Mesopotamian recipes survive only in fragments, so modern reconstructions are always partly speculative, but they hint at a cuisine more varied than the dry landscape might suggest. In a land shaped by canals and silt, food itself became one more form of cultivation. The rivers that made Mesopotamia possible also made it unpredictable, and flood control was one of the region's great practical challenges. The Tigris and Euphrates did not behave in a gentle, regular rhythm like some later idealized river systems. Their flooding could arrive unevenly, sometimes enriching fields, sometimes tearing channels apart, and sometimes leaving entire areas waterlogged or barren. Because of this, communities invested heavily in canals, embankments, levees, and drainage systems, all of which required constant maintenance. A neglected canal could silt up quickly, while a breached dike might ruin a season's labor in a single surge of muddy water. This meant that irrigation was not just a technological achievement, but a social obligation, demanding coordination among farmers, temple authorities, and rulers. The landscape of Mesopotamia was therefore partly natural and partly engineered, a living partnership between river and hand. Even today, when scholars reconstruct these systems, they can sense the immense patience required to keep water where it was needed. Mesopotamian kings often presented themselves not only as warriors or administrators, but as builders chosen to restore order in the world. In inscriptions, they proudly describe temples rebuilt, walls raised, canals dug, and cities protected, as if architecture itself were a form of kingship. A ruler's legacy could depend on whether he left behind a repaired shrine or a glittering new gate. This emphasis on construction helped transform political power into something visible and enduring, since bricks stamped with a king's name could be stacked into monuments that outlasted him by centuries. At the same time, kingship in Mesopotamia was never entirely fixed. Its legitimacy often had to be renewed through ritual, military success, or divine favor. Some texts reveal a tension between the ideal king and the fragile reality of rule, reminding us that authority had to be continually performed. In that sense, a palace wall or temple courtyard was not just a backdrop to history, but part of the language of power. The empire could be measured in roads, gates, and foundations as much as in armies. The city of one of the most famous centers of ancient Mesopotamia, was once a thriving place of homes, courtyards, temples, and narrow streets near the lower reaches of the Euphrates. Archaeologists have uncovered impressive tombs there, including burials filled with jewelry, musical instruments, and attendants, though the exact rituals surrounding them remain debated. The presence of such grave goods suggests beliefs about status, afterlife, or divine service that were deeply rooted and perhaps more complex than we can now fully reconstruct. Walking through the remains of in imagination, one can picture pale walls under a bright sky, with the ziggurat standing above the city like a fixed point in a shifting world. The city's long history also reminds us that Mesopotamian civilization was not a single moment, but a succession of rises, repairs, declines, and renewals. Was inhabited, abandoned, remembered, and rebuilt in different ways across many centuries. Its layers of occupation feel almost like pages turned slowly by wind and sand. Astronomy in Mesopotamia began with careful watching, and over time that watching became a highly organized science of the sky. Priests and scholars recorded the movements of planets, lunar phases, eclipses, and the timing of celestial omens, creating long sequences of observations that would later influence other cultures. The night sky above the river plains would have been exceptionally clear in many seasons, with stars appearing sharp and cold over dark fields and distant walls. Some celestial events were interpreted as messages from the gods, while others were tracked for practical purposes such as calendars and agricultural planning. The line between religion and science was not the line we might draw today. Instead, observation, interpretation, and prediction worked together. Babylonian astronomers became especially skilled at recognizing patterns, and their records helped establish methods that echoed far beyond Mesopotamia. Still, there is something humble in their work as well, because it depended on patience, repetition, and the willingness to keep looking upward night after night. The sky became a ledger of time. Mesopotamian law codes are often remembered for their severity, but they also reveal a society trying to regularize conflict through written principles. The most famous of these, associated with Hammurabi, is not the only law code from the region, and not even the earliest. Other collections show similar concerns with property, marriage, labor, injury, and contracts, suggesting a legal culture that was both practical and symbolic. The formulas can sound stern to modern ears, yet they also imply a belief that society should be ordered, legible, and judged according to known standards. A lawsuit might involve witnesses, written tablets, oaths, and local officials, all of which made law into a public process rather than a purely private matter. We should not imagine universal justice in the modern sense, since status and class often shaped outcomes, but the presence of codified rules still mattered. These laws helped define responsibility in a world of fields, canals, debts, and households. In the quiet scratch of a stylus on clay, disputes could be transformed into records. Mesopotamian music, though partly lost to time, is still visible in artifacts, texts, and the remains of instruments. Harps, lyres, drums, and reed pipes appear in burial scenes and ceremonial contexts, indicating a rich tradition of performance in both sacred and secular settings. The famous lyres from the royal cemetery at decorated with lapis, shell, and precious materials, suggest that music could be associated with courtly splendor as well as ritual solemnity. Songs may have accompanied feasts, laments, processions, and temple offerings, giving emotional shape to communal life. Because no complete musical notation survives in a form we can fully hear, much about the sound remains uncertain, which makes the subject feel both distant and intimate. We can imagine deep strings vibrating in a stone chamber, or a reed flute carrying through an open courtyard in the heat of the afternoon. Music would have been one way to soften the boundaries between the human and the divine, between memory and moment. In that sense, an ancient melody may. In the later history of Mesopotamia, one of the most striking changes was not simply who ruled the land, but how the land itself was imagined by outsiders. To the Persians, Greeks, Romans, and later travelers, Mesopotamia was more than a region between rivers. It was a place of deep memory, where old cities still seemed to linger in the dust, even when their power had faded. Babylon, in particular, became a kind of symbol. Long after its greatest buildings had fallen quiet, the name still carried the weight of enormous gates, broad processional ways, and sacred towers that had once reached into the bright sky. Ancient writers sometimes described the city with awe, and sometimes with exaggeration, but even the exaggerations tell us something important. Mesopotamia had become, in the imagination of the wider world, a land of ancient splendor so old that it already felt legendary. The ruins were not empty in the modern sense. They were layered with memory, reused by later peoples, and slowly buried beneath wind-blown soil. In that long quiet, history did not disappear. It softened, like a worn stone polished by generations of passing hands. A great deal of Mesopotamian history is preserved not in grand monuments, but in the small and practical things people left behind. Among the most revealing are the thousands of clay tablets found in homes, temples, palaces, and workshops. Many were simple records: grain deliveries, legal disputes, household lists, loans, tax receipts, and letters. These modest tablets can feel almost intimate because they bring us close to daily life. A scribe might note the amount of barley owed, while another tablet preserves a merchant's complaint or a family arrangement over land. Some records are fragmentary, yet even broken pieces have value. They remind us that ancient civilization was built not only by kings and warriors, but by accountants, apprentices, farmers, and clerks keeping track of the ordinary business of living. Clay was ideal for this purpose because it was abundant and cheap, and once dried, it could survive for millennia. What looks fragile at first glance has often turned out to be one of the most durable materials of the ancient world. In this way, the administrative heart of Mesopotamia became one of its strongest gifts to history. As later empires rose and fell across the region, Mesopotamian cities did not simply vanish at once. Many became layered places, where new peoples built over older foundations, and old streets were reused in altered forms. This gives archaeologists a special kind of challenge, because a single mound can contain centuries of occupation compressed into a quiet hill of earth. Beneath the surface, one settlement may rest on another, like pages stacked in a book that has been closed for a very long time. Sites such as Nippur, Nineveh, and Babylon became fields of study because they preserved these layers, though much was damaged by time, weather, and later human activity. The same city could have been inhabited by different languages, different gods, and different styles of building across its long life. In that sense, Mesopotamia was never a frozen civilization. It was always changing, adapting, and continuing in new forms. Even after political centers shifted away, the region remained a corridor of trade, agriculture, and memory. The rivers kept flowing, the canals had to be managed, and people still worked the soil with the patience that ancient life required. One of the quieter marvels of Mesopotamian history is the endurance of its intellectual traditions. Writing, astronomy, mathematics, and omen literature did not end with the earliest dynasties. They were copied, refined, and studied for centuries. Scholars in later Mesopotamian temples kept long lists of stars, planets, eclipses, and unusual celestial events. They looked upward with careful attention, believing the heavens carried messages that could be read with learned skill. Their observations were not modern science in the contemporary sense, yet they were disciplined, repeated, and remarkably systematic. Some of the same cuneiform traditions were still being used long after new alphabets had spread across the region. There is something gentle and moving in this continuity. Across many generations, a student could still trace wedge-shaped signs into damp clay, learning from tablets copied by hands long gone. Knowledge was not always carried in libraries built of stone. In Mesopotamia, it could rest in a clay room, on wooden shelves now vanished, waiting for a teacher, a priest, or a scholar to breathe life into it again. At the same time, Mesopotamia's religious landscape became increasingly diverse in its later history. Old city gods and temple traditions remained important, but foreign rulers and traveling populations brought new practices, new languages, and new ways of honoring the divine. The region became a meeting point for beliefs from many directions. Some deities were identified with similar figures from neighboring cultures, while some cults continued with strong local loyalty. Temples could serve not only as sacred spaces, but also as centers of economic life, storing grain, managing labor, and organizing ritual calendars. The boundary between religion and administration was often subtle. A temple procession might be as much a civic event as a spiritual one, and a sacrifice might also signal political order. For people living in these cities, the sacred was woven into daily routine. The smell of incense, the sound of chanting, the shine of polished metal offerings, and the careful washing of ritual objects all created a rhythm that repeated through the year. Even when later empires changed the shape of authority, the deep habit of sacred ceremony remained part of the landscape. Trade helped make Mesopotamia resilient, and its position between river and desert made it a natural crossroads. Goods moved through the region from distant places, timber from mountain areas, stones from farther lands, metals from the north and east, aromatics, textiles, and luxury items that traveled in caravan after caravan. Because much of southern Mesopotamia lacked large forests and some mineral resources, it depended on exchange networks that linked it to neighboring regions. In return, Mesopotamia offered grain, wool, cloth, skilled labor, and the administrative structures that made commerce possible. Merchants had to deal with weights, seals, contracts, and trust, and over time these practices became highly refined. The city was never isolated from the world. Even in periods of conflict, roads and rivers remained channels of connection. The movement of goods also carried ideas, styles, and stories. A seal impression, a foreign word, a distinctive metal vessel, or a new kind of bead could all reveal the broad web of contacts that tied Mesopotamia to faraway lands. The geography of the region encouraged this openness, because the rivers invited travel and the plains invited movement. Over the centuries, the physical shape of Mesopotamian settlement changed in response to the environment. Canals silted up, river channels shifted, and fields had to be managed with constant care. This meant that urban life was never entirely separate from agricultural labor. A city depended on the countryside, and the countryside depended on irrigation systems that required planning, repairs, and cooperation. Sometimes a waterway that supported a settlement for generations would gradually become less useful, prompting people to move or rebuild elsewhere. In this way, the history of Mesopotamia was shaped by patience as much as by power. The land asked for attention. It rewarded maintenance and punished neglect. Farmers knew the feel of damp soil and dry crust, the timing of floods, and the need to keep canals clear. Even in a grand imperial capital, the survival of the city depended on this ongoing care. The monumental architecture that later visitors remembered rested on a much quieter foundation of digging, clearing, lifting, and measuring. It is easy to admire the great palaces, but the deeper story belongs equally to the workers who kept water moving through the landscape. The surviving art of later Mesopotamia often reflects this blend of continuity and change. Reliefs, cylinder seals, glazed bricks, and sculpted figures reveal technical skill and symbolic meaning, but they also show how styles evolved across long periods. Some images repeat old themes with new materials. A ruler may still be shown in ceremonial pose, a divine symbol may still hover above a scene, or a lion may still represent strength and royal power. At the same time, foreign influences could alter the visual language of the region, introducing new fashions in clothing, ornament, or composition. Art was never static, and Mesopotamian craftsmen worked within traditions that were both conservative and creative. The quiet precision of a seal engraving, for example, could turn a simple object into a statement of identity and authority. A few tiny lines in stone might carry the history of a household or office. In some ways, these objects are like whispers from the past. They do not shout, they endure, and because they are small enough to pass from hand to hand, they can still feel unexpectedly personal, even after so many centuries. By the time later classical authors wrote about Mesopotamia, they were often already looking back at ruins and legends. This created a strange double vision. The region was real, inhabited, and politically active in many periods, yet it was also treated as a memory of the oldest civilization. Babylon, Assyria, and the broader land between the rivers became names that carried both scholarly curiosity and emotional weight. Modern archaeology has had to sort through this mixture of history and legend with great care. Excavators discovered that many ancient stories had a foundation in real places, but the evidence also showed how often memory enlarges what it remembers. A great city can become larger in imagination as it grows smaller in reality. That does not make the legend false in a simple sense. It means the legend has become part of the city's life after life. Mesopotamia survived not only through stone and clay, but through story, copied again and again by later cultures who could not quite forget how much had once happened there. Even in decline, the region retained a remarkable ability to sustain learning, worship, and local identity. People living in later centuries still inherited the practical habits of earlier Mesopotamian life.